Story, the Merchant, and the Mirage of Permanence. The golden dust of Savatthi hung suspended in the stagnant air of the afternoon, coating the sweat-slicked skin of a merchant named Malika as he stood amidst his mountains of woven silk and fragrant spices. His mind, a relentless engine of calculation, spun threads of future gain and past loss until the present moment was nothing more than a thin, transparent membrane stretched over the abyss of his anxieties. He looked upon his vast wealth not with the eyes of a master, but with the desperate gaze of a prisoner who believed the walls of his cell were the only things keeping the sky from collapsing upon him. Each coin was a heavy stone added to the internal architecture of his identity, a structure so complex and rigid that it left no room for the soft breath of the living world to enter. Nearby, the awakened one sat in the cooling shadow of a banyan tree, his presence a silent rebuke to the frantic vibration of the marketplace. Malika watched the Buddha and felt a strange, cold hollow opening within his chest, a space that all the gold in Magadha could not fill. He began to perceive the movement of his own thoughts as if they were a swarm of insects, chaotic and driven by a hunger that had no end and no true object. The silk beneath his fingers felt like spider webs, fragile and temporary, destined to rot even as he calculated its price in silver. He saw that his hands were not truly holding the world, but were being held by it, gripped by a primal fear of the void that lay beneath the surface of every transaction. The merchant realized that his life was a series of echoes, each one fainter than the last, reverberating through the canyons of his own desire. He contemplated the nature of the sun, which poured its light equally upon the king and the beggar, demanding nothing in return and leaving no trace of its generosity in the parched earth. His internal landscape, once a fortress of certainty, began to dissolve into the shifting sands of the very desert he had crossed to find his fortune. The concept of ownership revealed itself as a grand illusion, a costume worn by a ghost in a play that had no audience and no ending. He observed the way his breath entered and left his body, a rhythmic tidal movement that cared nothing for his status or his history. In this realization, the heavy weight of his attachment began to fray at the edges, allowing a single ray of unadorned light to pierce the density of his ego. He saw the faces of the travelers passing by, each one a mirror of his own struggle, each one a vessel of consciousness wandering through the same labyrinth of shadows. The marketplace, with its cacophony of voices and smells, became a quiet theater of the mind where the actors were merely flickering patterns of light and dark. He understood that the suffering he felt was not caused by the absence of things, but by the friction of his soul rubbing against the jagged edges of a self that did not truly exist. The silence of the Buddha seemed to expand, swallowing the noise of the city until there was only the sound of a dry leaf skittering across the dirt. Malika closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he did not try to count the seconds or the coins. He simply allowed the river of time to flow through him, neither resisting the current nor trying to reach the distant shore. Story: The Hermit and the Echo of the Unborn. Deep within the emerald shadows of the forest near Rajir, a man who had abandoned his name sat watching the slow descent of a single banyan leaf as it spiraled through the humid air. His consciousness was a vast, unrippled lake that reflected the ancient trees and the shifting clouds without ever becoming them. He had spent 40 years seeking the source of the wind, only to find that the seeker himself was composed of the very air he tried to grasp. The silence of the woods was not the absence of sound, but a profound presence that spoke in the language of decaying wood and sprouting seeds. He watched a spider weave its intricate web between two thorns, noting how the creature sat at the center of a universe it had created from its own body. The hermit recognized that his own mind was no different, spinning a web of concepts and memories to catch the flying moments of experience. He saw the patterns of his past lives not as a sequence of events, but as a recursive geometry of habits that repeated themselves like the seasons of the forest. Each thought was a seed that carried the blueprint of 1,000 future trees, a potential energy that waited for the moisture of desire to burst into form. The enlightened one had once walked this same path, leaving footprints in the mud that had long since been washed away by the monsoon rains. The hermit understood that the path was not a physical road, but a direction of awareness that led inward toward the point where the observer and the observed merged into a single flame. He observed the sensations in his legs, the dull ache and the cooling breeze, as impersonal events occurring in the field of the universal mind. The boundary of his skin felt porous, a temporary fence erected by a confused intellect to separate the inner wilderness from the outer one. He contemplated the nature of the void, not as a terrifying nothingness, but as the fertile womb of all possibilities from which every sound and shape emerged and to which they inevitably returned. The memory of his family, his lost kingdom, and his youthful pride floated past his vision like smoke from a distant charcoal burner's fire. He did not reach out to catch the smoke, nor did he try to blow it away. He simply watched the transformation of wood into ash and ash into earth. The structure of his ego, which he had once thought was a solid mountain, now appeared as a collection of loose pebbles held together by the gravity of his own fear. He saw that the world was not a collection of objects, but a symphony of processes that never stayed the same for the duration of a single heartbeat. The bird call that echoed through the canopy was not a thing to be understood, but a ripple in the stillness that revealed the depth of the silence. He realized that the search for liberation was the final obstacle, a golden chain that was just as binding as an iron one. The sun began to set, casting long, violet shadows across the forest floor, and the hermit felt the heat of the day leaving the stones. He was neither the light nor the shadow, but the awareness that contained them both without preference. There was no longer a man sitting under a tree, only the tree, the wind, and a vast, wordless understanding that needed no voice to affirm its truth. The cycle of samsara was not something to be escaped, but something to be seen through, like a transparent veil that only seemed opaque when one tried to grasp it. As darkness swallowed the forest, he remained motionless, a part of the night that had never been born and could never die. Story, the potter and the circle of becoming. The afternoon sun in the village of Uruvela was a heavy, molten weight that pressed the scent of baked earth into the very lungs of a potter named Kunda. He sat before his wooden wheel, his hands caked in a gray, primordial mud that felt like the skin of the world itself. As the wheel spun, a blurred circle of motion, Kunda's mind began to synchronize with the rhythmic hum of the axle, weaving a complex tapestry of intention and expectation. He watched as a formless lump of clay began to rise under the pressure of his thumbs, growing into a tall, elegant vessel that existed first as a phantom in the theater of his imagination. To Kunda, this pot was not merely an object, but a monument to his own skill, a tangible proof that he could impose his will upon the chaotic elements of nature. He did not see the clay as it truly was, a collection of minerals and moisture that had once been part of the mountains and the riverbeds, but rather as a servant to his desire for perfection. The movement of his mind was a constant oscillation between the pride of creation and the terrifying anticipation of failure. He thought of the 1,000 pots he had fired in the kiln. How many had cracked under the heat, and how many had been carried away to the kitchens of the wealthy. Each vessel was a ghost that haunted his awareness, a record of a self that was always trying to find a permanent home in a world of shifting forms. He contemplated the nature of the hands that held the clay, realizing they were composed of the same dust as the earth they manipulated, driven by a nervous energy that sought to escape the inevitability of decay. The wheel seemed to spin faster, becoming a metaphor for the recursion of his own thoughts, which circled the same anxieties and hopes with tireless persistence. He saw that the suffering of his labor was not in the physical exertion, but in the friction between the reality of the collapsing clay and the rigidity of his internal blueprint. When a small stone in the mud caused the wall of the pot to buckle, Kunda felt a surge of anger that was directed not at the clay, but at the instability of the universe itself. He paused, his muddy fingers suspended in the air, and looked toward the edge of the village where a group of monks walked in silent meditation. Their movement was like the flow of water, yielding and effortless, suggesting a state of being that was not anchored to the outcome of any action. Kunda began to observe the structure of his own disappointment, tracing its roots back to the belief that he was the center of the spinning world. He realized that the pot was already broken in the very moment it was conceived, for its existence was predicated on a change that would eventually return it to the dust. The internal pressure to succeed began to dissolve, replaced by a cool, spacious awareness that watched the wheel turn without needing to control its speed. He understood that the creator and the created were two sides of the same flickering shadow, a dance of light and darkness played out on the screen of a consciousness that remained forever still. The clay felt different now, no longer a resistant force to be conquered, but a partner in a wordless conversation about the nature of impermanence. He allowed his hands to move with the clay rather than against it, letting the vessel find its own equilibrium in the space between the spinning wheel and the open sky. The pride of the artisan was swallowed by the humility of the observer, leaving only the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the soft, rhythmic slapping of wet mud against a wooden board. He saw that the true work was not the shaping of the pot, but the dismantling of the potter who believed he stood outside the circle of becoming. Story: The Traveler and the Mirage of the Gate. The road from the city of Vaishali was a long, winding ribbon of white dust that stretched toward the hazy purple peaks of the northern mountains. A traveler named Jetta walked this path with a heavy pack and a heart that felt even heavier, filled with the echoes of every step he had taken since his youth. His mind was a restless map maker, constantly projecting the destination onto the horizon while ignoring the actual texture of the stones beneath his feet. He believed that at the end of the road there lay a gate of golden light, a place where all his questions would be answered and his internal turmoil would finally cease. This destination was a sanctuary he had built out of the bricks of his own dissatisfaction, a mental fortress that allowed him to endure the hardships of the journey by devaluing the reality of the present. As he walked, he observed how his thoughts were like a series of mirages shimmering on the hot road, promising a relief that always receded as he approached. He saw the way his ego identified with the role of the seeker, finding a subtle pride in his own fatigue and a sense of importance in the magnitude of his search. The dust on his clothes was a badge of his perseverance, yet he realized that the more he moved toward his goal, the more the goal itself seemed to transform into a cage. He contemplated the movement of the sun, which traversed the sky without any apparent effort or intention, shedding its light upon the traveler and the road with an indifference that felt like a profound wisdom. His internal monologue was a chaotic choir of voices, some urging him to run faster and others begging him to collapse in the shade of a neem tree. He began to examine the structure of the I that was doing the walking, searching for a solid core amidst the shifting sensations of muscle strain and thirst. He found nothing but a flow of experiences, a stream of consciousness that was as fluid and ungraspable as the air. The landscape around him changed from fertile fields to rocky wastes, but the observer within him remained strangely untouched by the scenery. He realized that he had been carrying the city of Vaishali within him all along, its noises and its attachments acting as a weight that slowed his progress more than any physical burden. The gate he sought was not a structure of wood and stone, but a threshold of perception that existed in every moment he chose to stop running. He watched a group of pilgrims passing in the opposite direction, their faces etched with the same frantic hunger for an ending that he felt in his own bones. It occurred to him that the entire world was a mass of travelers, all walking toward different horizons while staying rooted in the same fundamental confusion. The road was not a means to an end, but the very manifestation of the mind's desire to be somewhere other than where it was. He sat down by a dry well and closed his eyes, allowing the silence of the wilderness to penetrate the noise of his ambitions. He saw that the journey was an elaborate strategy to avoid the terrifying simplicity of just being. The idea of the destination began to crumble like a wall of sand, leaving him standing in a vast, borderless space where there was no here and no there. He perceived the rhythm of his own heartbeat as the drum of an ancient ritual that celebrated nothing but its own pulse. The white dust of the road no longer seemed like an obstacle, but like a fine powder of stars that had fallen to the earth to remind him of his own celestial origin. He understood that liberation was not a place to be reached, but the sudden realization that the gate had always been wide open, and that there was no one left to walk through it. He stood up, not because he had to reach the mountains, but because the legs moved and the road was there. He walked with a lightness that made him feel as though he were floating just above the dirt, a ghost in a landscape that was finally recognized as a dream. The weight of his pack was gone, for he had emptied it of all his certainties and all his fears. The mountains remained distant and purple, and the traveler remained where he was, moving through the world with the silent grace of a cloud drifting across a summer sky. Story: The Weaver and the Fabric of the Unseen. In the cooling shadow of the hills surrounding the city of Shravasti, a woman named Maya sat before an ancient wooden loom, her fingers moving with a precision that seemed to borrow from the rhythmic pulse of the earth itself. Her mind was a second loom, a hidden apparatus of consciousness that wove a garment of thoughts even more intricate than the silk draped across her knees. Every thread of colored thread she selected was a memory, dyed in the deep ochre of old griefs or the pale gold of fleeting triumphs, and she believed that by finishing this tapestry, she could finally clothe her soul in a permanent identity. She watched the shuttle fly back and forth, seeing it as a metaphor for the relentless transit of the sun, a cycle that promised only the repetition of its own movement without ever arriving at a final destination. The silence of the workshop was filled with the internal monologue of her anxieties, a chaotic choir of voices that debated the quality of the weave and the judgment of the merchants who would eventually possess her work. She did not realize that her awareness had become entangled in the very fibers she manipulated, turning the act of creation into a subtle form of imprisonment where the creator was defined by the object. The awakened one had once walked past her door, his footsteps leaving no more mark on the dust than a bird's shadow on the water. Yet the memory of his stillness haunted her like a forgotten song. She began to observe the structure of her own perception, noticing how her mind would seize upon a single flaw in the silk and magnify it until the entire world felt distorted and broken. she saw that her struggle was not with the loom or the thread, but with the internal architect who insisted that the pattern must conform to a rigid blueprint of perfection. The silk beneath her hands felt increasingly heavy, a weight composed of all the expectations she had inherited from her ancestors and all the fears she projected into the lives of her children. She contemplated the nature of the silkworm, which sacrificed its existence to produce a thread that others would use to adorn their fleeting status in the kingdom of men. In this moment of deep reflection, she perceived the space between the threads, the vast and silent emptiness that allowed the fabric to have form and substance. Her life was not the thread, she realized, but the silent awareness that held the entire process in its unblinking gaze. The tension in her shoulders began to dissolve, and the frantic vibration of her thoughts slowed to a gentle hum that matched the swaying of the trees outside. She saw that the weaver and the woven were not separate entities, but a single movement of light and shadow played out on the screen of an eternal present. The need to finish the garment lost its urgency, for she understood that no cloth could ever provide a sanctuary for a spirit that was already as boundless as the sky. She allowed the shuttle to fall from her hand, not out of weariness, but as an act of profound surrender to the flow of a universe that needed no justification for its existence. The stars began to appear in the velvet night, and Maya remained motionless, watching the moonlight play across the unfinished silk with the eyes of someone who had finally stepped out of the dream of her own making. The tapestry remained incomplete, yet in its broken pattern, she found a wholeness that no amount of weaving could ever provide. Story: The King and the Mirror of Emptiness. High upon the marble terraces of the palace in Kapilavastu, King Suddhodana stood overlooking a kingdom that he believed was the physical extension of his own will. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of temple bells, yet the king's mind was a fortress of iron and stone, fortified against the creeping suspicion that his power was as fragile as a breath of wind. He looked upon his subjects as if they were pieces on a chessboard, their lives and deaths merely data points in the grand calculation of his reign. His internal architecture was built upon the concept of sovereignty, a belief that he stood at the center of a stable universe that owed its existence to his command. However, beneath the crown, a relentless anxiety gnawed at his awareness, a fear of the time when his hands would no longer be able to hold the scepter and his voice would no longer be heard in the halls of state. He began to perceive the movement of his own thoughts as a series of ghosts haunting the corridors of his intellect, each one whispering of the inevitable decay that awaited every throne and every empire. He remembered his son, who had walked away from this very palace to seek a truth that could not be conquered by armies, and he felt a cold hollow opening in his chest that no amount of tribute could fill. The king observed the way he identified with the rituals of his office, how the very clothes he wore were designed to hide the vulnerability of his aging skin. He saw that his entire life had been a performance for an audience of his own making, a frantic attempt to prove that the ego was a solid and permanent reality. He contemplated a single drop of dew on a lotus leaf, noting how it reflected the entire palace while remaining entirely separate from it, destined to evaporate at the first touch of the morning sun. His consciousness was like that drop of dew, a temporary vessel of awareness that had mistakenly believed it was the ocean. He began to examine the I that claimed to be king, searching through the layers of memory and status for a core that was not dependent on the external world. He found nothing but a flow of sensations, a river of experience that had no owner and no captain. The boundary between the ruler and the ruled began to blur in his perception, as he realized that the beggar in the street and the king on the throne were both manifestations of the same primordial hunger for existence. The weight of the crown felt like a heavy stone on his brow, a symbol of a burden he had chosen to carry out of a profound misunderstanding of his own nature. He watched the sun sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows that swallowed the palace and the gardens. And he understood that the darkness was not an enemy to be feared, but the natural state from which all light emerged. The structure of his pride collapsed, leaving him standing in a vast and silent space where there were no titles and no commands. He saw that the true kingdom was not a territory to be governed, but the stillness of the mind that had stopped trying to conquer the world. The echoes of his past glories sounded like the chatter of monkeys in the forest, meaningless and far away. He realized that the search for permanence was the very source of his suffering, and that liberation was found in the total acceptance of the transient and the empty. The king closed his eyes, and for the first time, he did not see his kingdom. He only saw the light that illuminated his own awareness. He stood on the terrace as the night deepened, a man who was no longer a king because he had finally discovered that there was no one left to rule. The cycle of birth and death was seen as a majestic dance of shadows, and the king remained in the center of the mirror, reflecting everything while holding on to nothing.